This is Craig Brown, and welcome to Passages. Passages is a space to explore Bible passages used for preaching, reflection, and prayer. My hope is that Passages will shine a unique light on text used for preaching at the First Free Methodist Church of Seattle, or for anyone looking to dive deeper into the Bible. Today's passage is Luke chapter 9, verses 28 to 43. It's the basis for the sermon at First Free Methodist Church on Sunday, March 2, 2025. It's the final message in our series called This is the Way, the Path of Following Jesus. Let's hear the passage, beginning at the 28th verse of the 9th chapter of the Gospel of Luke, and I'll be reading from the 2020 revision of the New American Standard Bible. About 8 days after these sayings, he took Peter, John, and James and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face became different, and his clothing became white and gleaming. And behold, two men were talking with him, and they were Moses and Elijah, who, appearing in glory, were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions had been overcome with sleep, but when they were fully awake, they saw his glory and the two men who were standing with him. And these two men were leaving him. And Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good that we are here. And let's make 3 tabernacles, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not realizing what he was saying. But while he was saying this, a cloud formed and began to overshadow them. And they were afraid as they entered the cloud. And then a voice came from the cloud saying, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and reported to no one in those days any of the things which they had seen. On the next day, when they came down from the mountain, a large crowd met him. And a man from the crowd shouted, saying, "Teacher, I beg you to look at my son, because he is my only son, and a spirit seizes him and suddenly screams, and it throws him into convulsion with foaming at the mouth. And only with difficulty does it leave him, mauling him as it leaves. And I begged your disciples to cast it out, but they could not." And Jesus answered and said, "You unbelieving and perverse generation, how long shall I be with you and put up with you? Bring your son here." Now, while he was still approaching, the demon slammed him to the ground and threw him into convulsion. But Jesus rebuked the unclean spirit and healed the boy, and then gave him back to his father. You know, this is a powerful text, and it is used on this particular Sunday, which happens to be Transfiguration Sunday. It's the Sunday before the season of Lent begins on Ash Wednesday. And so the Transfiguration of Jesus is a fixture because it focuses on the moment in Jesus' life and journey before he begins the process of going from that mount to eventually Jerusalem, where he would be betrayed and crucified and eventually resurrected. And so the Transfiguration is kind of a pivot point for us in the story of Jesus as he begins to make this journey toward Jerusalem. And so we'll start out by looking at verses 28 to 31, which tells us about how he is preparing for the journey. Luke's version of the Transfiguration stands alone. Now, while the Transfiguration is included in both Matthew and Mark's gospel, Luke's version is filled with a little bit of detail and gravity that's not included in those other stories. It centers on the journey that Jesus is now going to undertake. This story in Luke chapter 9 bears parallels with the story of Moses' encounter with God as it's recorded in Exodus chapter 24. Like Moses, Jesus takes 3 companions with him, and the parallels between these two stories are about liberation. Moses, when he went with 3 friends up the mountain, he received tablets, the tablets of the law. In this particular story we have in Luke chapter 9, we don't have any tablets. Jesus, in every way, is the tablet. He is the communication. So as Jesus goes up to the mountain with Peter, James, and John, his appearance is changed. Now, the word he uses here for changed is a little different than the one used by Mark. Luke is trying to draw a connection that just like Moses' appearance was changed by being on the mountain, so is Jesus' appearance having been augmented as well. And it takes place in a moment of prayer, the text tells us in Luke 9, but the disciples, Peter, James, and John, they're asleep. It's for this reason that some have concluded that the transfiguration didn't happen during the day, but it may have happened during the night. And so Jesus appears in the transfiguration after his countenance or his appearance has been changed with Moses and Elijah. Now, there are many similarities in the stories of Moses and Elijah, and along with this story as it's unfolding in Luke 9. Both Moses and Elijah met God on Sinai. Both of them had strange sort of departures, if you will. Moses, of course, representing the law, Elijah representing the prophets. This is all about this amazing setting in the midst of this story. And so the essence of this story, at least as we open it up in verses 28 to 31, is the subject of the conversation, though. It's not just about the appearance of Jesus with Moses and Elijah. It's what they're talking about. It tells us in Luke's gospel that they're talking about Jesus's journey to Jerusalem. So namely, they're speaking of Jesus's death. And remember, this is a story about salvation and liberation. So this is what Moses and Elijah both point to. They point to the liberation of God's people, the salvation of God's people. So what we have to recognize here is that both Moses and Elijah had these journeys of suffering that were transformational for both of them. And here Jesus is prepared to enter his journey of suffering, which of course is going to be transformational through his resurrection. This is what they're talking about. And it opens a key passageway for us. That the act of love requires a summoning of courage and faith. The act of love requires a summoning of courage and faith. Jesus' work is not one of mere loving kindness in his stories and his miracles. They're that for sure. But it's one that will intersect the cross. So its inevitability makes it sound like his destiny. Jesus knows what his life and ministry will do and what it will cause. He knows it takes him to the cross, and he knows the work of God that will be accomplished there. So this moment with Moses and Elijah on the Mount of Transfiguration is about courage and faith. It's about Jesus' commitment of love that will take him to the cross. And so the conversation that Moses, Elijah, and Jesus are having is considered. It's real. It's weighted. It's not about fate. Jesus chooses this path. So as we consider the acts of love God presents us with, we have to weigh the same things. Is it worth it? Can we do it? Can we follow this path? Because you see, love is embodied in action. Feeling is not the issue. Jesus is encouraged and strengthened for the cross that will come. So how do we do the math about living a life of sacrificial service and love in Jesus' name? Is it a passing moment, easy come, easy go, or is it calculated? Is it deliberate? Is it thoughtful and prayerful? This is the example we see in Jesus of summoning that kind of courage as he makes his choice. Now, in verses 32 and 33 of Luke chapter 9, there's a narrative that emerges that begins to try to prevent the journey to Jerusalem. And of course, the prevention of that journey is going to center on Peter, James, and John, but namely Peter. You know, they have not seen the encounter or the conversation. Note how Luke tells the story. Peter, James, and John do not hear the content of what Moses, Elijah, and Jesus are speaking about. The text tells us that they only see the fact that Moses and Elijah are there at the very end of the story before they're gone. So Peter's story is the story of all of us. Well-intended, but ill-informed. Moses and Elijah prepare to depart. How Peter knew who they were is unknown. It doesn't tell us in the text how he could recognize Moses and Elijah. Peter wants that moment frozen in time. So he says, let me build 3 tents for you, or tabernacles, these little tent shrines, if you will, so that people could come see them. So, Peter awakes from his sleep believing that this moment is the end. Here's Jesus, transfigured with Moses and Elijah. This must be it. What better moment to freeze in time? This new Exodus story of Jesus could be frozen in concept, but just not in action. What he wants is to build a tent for them. And what Peter fails to see here is that Jesus is preparing to build a tent much larger than he can imagine through the cross. Now, Peter, let's be honest, he's not in active denial of the cross. He may not see it as an eventual outcome. He eventually will be in active denial of the cross, but he may not be at this point. But he does represent in a lot of ways that kind of good enough mentality. If we could just freeze this moment in time, Peter has no idea that his well-intended act would actually prevent the cross from happening. He becomes an unwitting obstacle to the full revealing of God's love and salvation in Jesus. He forgets his position, information, his role, and even his function. Hence, that's why Luke tells us that as Peter's talking about these tabernacles, Luke says that he doesn't even realize what he's saying. He's talking in a moment of anxiety and wonderment. It opens a key passageway to us that we need to remember as we read this story. We must remember what we do not know. We must remember what we do not know. It may seem like a riddle to some degree, but it's not. You've heard the idiom before, perhaps, at least within American culture, that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Peter's move here is to create as what my generation would call a Kodak moment on Magic Mountain, that he wants to sell tickets for admission. He wants this thing to be frozen in time. He feels like this is the moment he signed up for, he's been waiting for, is the revelation of Jesus in glory. Well, I know, speaking for myself, my own impatience of allowing God's grace and love in action in my own life, and how I, like Peter, governed too much by impulse, governed by this sense of wanting to see it and have it now. So in order to steer out of that skid means that we've got to learn to live in moments of uncertainty. There's a mystery and wonder in our life with God. The quest of Christian spirituality is not for knowledge or certainty. In many ways, it's the opposite. The quest is really to trust in faith that God can and will work, and especially in those moments when we don't know much or anything at all. What follows in verses 34 to 36 now is protecting that journey of Jesus to Jerusalem. And what happens here is what Peter's articulating in his desire to build these tabernacles is a barrier to the work that Jesus needs to accomplish. His kind of good enough recommendation cut short the saving grace of God. He just doesn't know it yet. And so while he was saying this, when he was in the middle of him talking about these tents and tabernacles he wanted to build, and the grammar is really key here because it says that this cloud overcame them, but it overcame them while he's talking. So literally imagine Peter talking about this, and as he's talking, a cloud comes over. It's almost like a scripted comedy that in the middle of his conversation, this cloud appears. Now the cloud, from a biblical perspective, is, believe it or not, God's mode of transportation. Elijah is assumed into heaven on a cloud. There was a cloud on Sinai when Moses went up onto the mountain. There's dozens of examples of clouds functioning in this way. So Luke's image here is powerful. Remember, A cloud means you can't see. You lose certainty. You lose that kind of absolute knowledge of your surroundings when you're stuck in a cloud or like a heavy, heavy fog bank. And that's what happens here. So there's these words that come from the cloud, and they say, "This is my son, my chosen one. Listen to him." It reflects the same language that's used as Jesus emerges from baptism earlier in the gospel. This event, recorded in 2 other gospels, now begins to gain some clarity. This is the inauguration of the second act of Jesus' ministry, and it is the journey to the cross. God's message is clear to Peter. You haven't heard him yet. Peter hasn't heard Jesus yet. Jesus' preaching and teaching point to the confrontation with powers and authorities of this world, not only the Romans and the Jewish authorities, but the power of sin. Peter can't envision a cross as anything other than a failure. So as quickly as this moment begins up on the mountain with the appearance of Jesus, with Moses and Elijah, the cloud comes, the voice speaks, and before you know it, it's all over. And it tells us in verse 36 that they kept silent. Likely, that awkward kind of silence when we see ourselves in genuine perspective. They found themselves, Peter, James, and John, in a place of confusion, wonder, and being speechless. It opens a key passageway for us, that God's work in us and the world is purposeful. God's work in us and in the world is purposeful. Part of Peter's error, which is very much so much like our own, is that he sees the event in relationship to himself. He can't see the event as part of a unfolding of God's purposefulness. As we move through our days with friends and spouses and co-workers, whoever we might be with, even strangers, we have to consider the fact that God is at work in them and in us very purposefully. That reality becomes a mystery filled with some uncertainty for us. Jesus is going to a cross. This is not the blessing of a mountaintop. It's a conversation about death. And what would happen if we moved through each day in our own lives, each moment in our own life, looking for God's purposefulness right there in that moment, in us and in the lives of others, instead of simply looking to see how things and people impact us. This is the perspective of grace, of love, of being in God. Like the disciples, if we were to stand in that space of beholding the greatness of all that God is doing, it might leave us speechless too. Now we turn to the closing of this text, which is really kind of the second part of the Transfiguration story, which is in Luke chapter 9, verses 37 to 45. The story moves from one event to the next. So remember, the Transfiguration likely occurred at night, which explains why the disciples were sleeping when most of it happened. So it's now daybreak, and Jesus comes down the mountain with Peter, James, and John. Now, upon arriving at the bottom of the mountain, there's a large crowd gathered around, and we soon find out why. In the crowd is a man who begins shouting at Jesus, and the man explains what's happening to his only son, and Luke is coy here to use his only son in the exact same way Jesus would speak of himself as the only son. And he apparently suffers, this only son of this man, from some form of epilepsy, which is described here as a demon that's afflicting him. Now, aside from the manifestations happening to the boy, the key here is that the disciples could not cast out that demon. They could not bring healing to this young person. Now, earlier in this chapter 9, beginning at verse 1, Jesus sent the disciples out to do this very work. And their earlier mission was quite successful. You might remember when Jesus sent out the 70, he said, I want you to go cast out demons, I want you to heal the sick, I want you to proclaim the repentance, so on and so forth. He gives them clear instructions. So what they're trying to do in this episode is no different than what Jesus asked them to do before. So it seems odd that all of a sudden they can no longer do the thing that they had just been doing before Jesus went up onto the mountain. So in response to this situation of the crowd being gathered, the man is upset because his son is not healed yet. The disciples are, kind of going through whatever mixed emotions and thoughts they have about their failure to be able to do the work that has been given to them to do. Then Jesus speaks to them, and he turns to a familiar saying associated also with Moses, just like up on the mountain. And the saying that Jesus makes to all of the crowd there is based in Deuteronomy 32, verse 5, and in Numbers 11, verse 12. And they both had to do with Moses' frustration with the people of Israel. The association is clear. Jesus was just on the mountain with Moses and Elijah. And so now the transfiguration starts to get a little bit clearer in its focus. Jesus rebukes the people using these words from Deuteronomy and Numbers, and he calls them an unbelieving and perverse generation, and basically saying, how long am I going to have to put up with you? And then, after he rebukes everyone, he invites the son to be brought forward. So as the boy approaches, the symptoms manifest themselves again. And here's what's interesting. With very little fanfare, it says in Luke's gospel that Jesus rebukes the demon, heals him, and gives the boy back to his father. Very simple, very matter of fact. Verse 43 tells us of the astonishment of the crowd, but says nothing of the disciples' reaction. So isn't it interesting that the crowd is amazed at Jesus, not because of anything that happened on a mountain, but they're amazed at Jesus because of what happens in the valley when he is with them. As soon as this episode ends, and we're not quite sure whether the crowd is still there or not, Jesus turns to his disciples, all of them now, including Peter, James, and John. He says, let these words sink into your ears. It's a slightly insulting language, implying that he's told them this before, but they haven't heard it. And he says one very simple statement: the Son of Man is going to be handed over. Now, when he talks about the Son of Man, that's a reference to Daniel chapter 7, where we find one of these early references to the idea of the Son of Man. And this is when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, also known as Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, are in the fiery furnace. And the king looks in the furnace, and he sees one dancing in the fire with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who look like a son of man. So Jesus uses the same title for himself, that the Son of Man is to be handed over. Jesus is not handing over himself. This is what is called in grammar the divine passive. He's not handing himself over. Listen to how Jesus phrases it. The Son of Man, talking about himself in the third person, is going to be handed over. So someone else is handing Jesus over. The disciples don't understand the statement at all that Jesus has said. Even though he said, let these words sink into your ears, they still haven't understood it. It says in the text that it was concealed from them. And this is likely in part due to the same incapacity that the disciples had to heal the boy, is that they can't hear Jesus either. See, what's happening here is in some ways they're embracing the power of Jesus's ministry, which we know from earlier in chapter 9. They went out on a preaching mission, healing people and, casting out demons, but now they can't do it. So they're embracing Jesus's power, but they're not embracing his meaning yet. And that's a key passageway for us. Being with Jesus means a cross-shaped life. Being with Jesus means a cross-shaped life. The meaning of the transfiguration becomes clear here. So you see, what happens off of the mountain is vastly more important than what happens on the mountain. The way of the cross is clear. Jesus has not minced his words at all. He is crystal clear about what's going to happen. So why did the disciples fail? It's hard to name that for certain, but there are just a few clues sitting around that might help us. One, the disciples had the power of Jesus, but they didn't have any of the meaning of it. Could also be that the power they had was they treated the power that they had as being for them and not for others. And perhaps, I think most importantly in this text, is they can't conceive yet of a Jesus who dies. So when we hear these strong words at the end of this story, we need to hear them as being directed at us too. Are we happy to share in the power and glory of Jesus, but not necessarily the means by which it comes? This is not a criticism of the disciples, but it is a moment of clarity for them as much as it's a moment of clarity for us. Is the transfiguration of Jesus what happened on the mountain, that his earthly appearance was changed into a radiant and divine appearance? Or is the transfiguration the leaving of that transfigured appearance to come down to the valley? It's a good question to wonder about, and its meaning for us today. If you have comments or reflections, I'd love to hear from you. Please visit my website, revcraig.com. Click on News in the upper right-hand corner. You'll see on a drop-down menu the word podcast. Click on that, and then click on this week's episode and leave a comment. Also encourage you to visit ffmc.org. That's firstfreemethodistchurch.org. That's our website to learn more about Free Methodism and how you can connect with our community. For now, I bid you all grace. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.